Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Freedom of the Press with John Mousseau. To begin my foray into news analysis, I would like to speak briefly on the Syrian civil war. Just give a quick summary. Not going to go into too much detail. I don't want to cite anything. I'm just going to relay my basic knowledge and understanding as I know it currently. And if you want a reference for where I'm getting my information, whatever political bias, whatever sinister deeds I might be intending to do with this particular podcast, you can check syria.liveuamap.com. It's my favorite website for surveying conflicts globally, and I highly recommend it. With every war, one of the most difficult things to answer is when does it truly begin? Arguments can be made that World War II began in 1914. That began with the start of World War I. After that, it was inevitability. However, for the Syrian Civil War, many agree that it began with the protests of the Arab Spring, culminating in retaliatory measures against Syrian protesters by President Bashar al-Assad. Reports vary, and I really, again, depending on which biased viewpoint you happen to take, they may be entirely untrue. But reports state that due to the panic caused by the Arab Spring, Bashar al-Assad regarded the protests in his country as a threat to his government's survival. And he retaliated by sending military forces, which eventually led to civilian casualties. Led to people being gunned down in the streets because they sought some sort of political change. Now, there aren't very many ways you can react to this. I can only impart an American perspective, but when I realize that my government is shooting at me, the natural inclination is either to hide, run, or fight. Just so happens in this scenario that quite a few people decided to pick up their AK-47 and fight. It's led to widespread unrest in major metropolitan areas, such as Aleppo, and eventually culminated in armed insurrection that became gradually more organized over time. The government response was inadequate. It did not stamp out these insurrectionists, and eventually, front lines were established, and skirmishes continued for years. Soon after that, a terrorist group by the name of the Islamic State of Iraq declared a caliphate, recruited a series of radicals, and began a offensive in the northern part of Iraq and the eastern part of Syria, capturing many towns, many military bases, capturing arms, and civilians in their wake. Such was the success of their campaign that they were actually to exercise a degree of sovereignty over the villages they captured and started making all those ridiculous propaganda videos of the Toyota pickup trucks driving through the streets of Mosul and Raqqa. Today, those cities are still at least partially held by ISIS. The consequence of the emergence of ISIS, along with the simultaneous insurrection inside the state of Syria, meant that the government was no longer able to exercise control over the countryside, which left various groups at the mercy of ISIS, one of them being the Kurdish minority of northern Syria, northern Iraq, and southern Turkey. They were pushed back fairly far. It is from this particular motion that we get the reports of the hallowed Christian refugees hiding out on a mountain, waiting for Papa America to save them. When the conflict, stabilized, it instantly became one of the most complicated civil wars in recent history. The Iraqi military was fighting ISIS in the northern part of the country, heck, even as close as Baghdad. The Kurds were fighting ISIS in the northern part of Syria and the northern part of Iraq. ISIS occupied a large amount of territory in the central countryside of Syria and Iraq, and controlled the two major cities, Mosul and Raqqa. The Syrian government was regulated to the western portion of its country. What could be said, their international borders, they could only really exercise control or conduct military operations on the westernmost part. And insurrection came so close as Damascus, the capital city. They're still fighting there today. But one of the main theaters of conflict was Aleppo, which was virtually isolated from other rebel-held areas by the government forces. Just this past year, Aleppo fell to the Syrian government, and many of the rebels either died or evacuated. Today, the fighting is still ongoing. The rebels only control a few portions of the Syrian countryside, north of Hama, the area known as Idlib. Excuse my pronunciations, of course. They still hold a small portion of Damascus. And to the south, a town by the name of Dara and the surrounding area around it. Now, it must be stated that these rebels, air quote, have varied interests in mind when they fight and die for their causes. Some are religious fanatics. Some are, the more moderate. That word has been completely sullied. People who just want some form of democratic change or representation in the Syrian government. And others are just poor folks caught in between, who decided to pick up a rifle and now have just given too much to ever stop fighting again. The Syrian government itself is allied with Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. They host various mercenary forces. They are supported by Russian air support and exercise control over the territories that they do control through various military police forces conscripted from their civilian population. I'm not sure what else that can be said other than America has decided to enter into this four-way mess. It is almost early on in the conflict, the Obama administration attempted to support the rebels with arms, training, and financing. The training was unsuccessful. The arming was. The financing was. And nowadays, if you ask anyone who doesn't quite appreciate the efforts of our American government, this amounted to direct financing and arming of terrorist groups that are now attempting to destroy a secular and legitimate government so that they might institute religious authority over the region and spread terrorism throughout the world. It is difficult to fully comprehend what these people want, why they're fighting, why people kill, why they are willing to be killed for various causes. And I will never purport to know exactly what these people want. Heck, I don't even know anyone in it. I've never been there. All I have is a multicolored map with Twitter accounts poking forth and saying something like there's an airstrike here or there. So when I talk about the Syrian civil war, I am speaking from a very, well, how do I put this, detached perspective. I understand the events as they have unfolded. Anyone can research that. I understand that multiple sides are involved with varied interests and allegiances. Anyone can research that. I understand that new events, new controversy will emerge. Anyone can research that. But what I notice, particularly with this war, is that it has become more of a war of information among those who are similarly detached from the actual conflict. It's all interpretation. It's all which sources you happen to consult, which views you happen to promote. I'm of the mind that the United States, that Europe, that Western civilization generally does not necessarily have a stake in the conflict. I'm also of the mind that Russia does not either. I see their intervention, both of their interventions, as strategic initiatives. They are not moral crusades. They are not trying to benefit the morally superior side in a conflict so segmented and so confused that most today cannot even name one of the rebel factions. Or the fact that the Kurds are fighting as well, or the fact that the Iraqis fought as well. All that's known is that there's ISIS, it's bad. There's the rebels in the government, it's confusing. America and Russia have vested strategic interests in the region, almost entirely geographical, perhaps depending on what resources are there. So, purely by virtue of my living in the United States, I will often take the side of the United States. I will attempt to explain things from the perspective of someone who has learned and studied and experienced their entire lives within the borders of this particular country. But I will also speak of Russian affairs, interests, actions, intentions in the region. I will be called biased. I will be called short-minded. I will be called sheep. I will be called deceived. However, I will attempt to be fair. I will attempt to educate. That is my goal here. Nothing more, nothing less. And if I do anything more, you can call me out for it. Go right ahead. Have a wonderful evening. Good night. Godspeed. I haven't quite decided on a farewell send-off message yet. More to follow. Thanks for joining me. This is Freedom of the Press with John Mousseau.